A German shepherd abandoned to his fate on the side of a deserted road. When everyone ignores him, a powerful farmer decides to stop, and nothing in his life will ever be the same again. The sky over Lancaster was heavy with dark clouds when Frank Anderson adjusted the rearview mirror of his pickup truck and accelerated down the main road. At 42, he carried on his shoulders the weight of being the region's largest coffee producer, but also a loneliness that grew like weeds in abandoned soil. His farm, which stretched over more than 1,000 acres of fertile land, was known by all as an example of prosperity and modernity, but few knew of the silence that inhabited the main house at the end of the day. "I need to get there before 5, he muttered to himself, checking the clock on the dashboard. The meeting with the cattle buyers had gone on longer than expected, and he still had financial matters to resolve with Robert, his manager, before the end of the workday. It was always like this, a race against time, an endless list of commitments. That kept him too busy to think about anything other than work. He decided to take the detour along the old road, the one that cut through the eucalyptus plantations and rarely had traffic. He knew every curve of that dirt path, every hole, every steep climb between the red hills of California. The wind shook the thin branches of the trees, creating dancing shadows on the dusty windshield, while the sound of tires crushing the soft earth created a hypnotizing rhythm. It was then that his gaze, trained to examine details of pasture and plantation, caught something different in the monotonous landscape. At the edge of the road, tied to a rusty guardrail, was a form that wasn't moving. Frank slowed down, frowning. At first he thought it might be an abandoned feed sack or perhaps a backpack lost by some traveler, but as he approached, the outline became clearer. It was a dog, a thin German shepherd with tangled fur and visible ribs, head down and eyes half closed. Only the slow movement of its chest indicated that there was still life in that exhausted body. Frank parked the pickup a few yards ahead, feeling something strange tighten in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd felt that sensation, as if a locked door inside him had creaked slightly open. He got out of the vehicle with heavy steps on the dry earth, approaching slowly. The animal didn't growl or show any reaction, as if it didn't even have the strength to feel fear. The marks of the old rope around its neck were visible, as were 2 empty plastic bowls fallen beside it, covered with dust. Whoever had abandoned that dog there had planned to let it slowly waste away. Frank crouched down, carefully extending his hand. The German shepherd raised its sunken, dull, but still living eyes. There was no pleading in that look, only a deep resignation that echoed something familiar in the farmer's heart. It was the same resignation he saw in the mirror every morning, the same silent acceptance of a fate that seemed unchangeable. "You're tired too, aren't you?" he murmured, slowly untying the knot of the rope that held the animal to the guardrail. His hands, accustomed to sealing deals and signing contracts, trembled slightly as they touched that wounded neck. The dog just blinked slowly, as if understanding that something was changing. Mentally, Frank calculated the health risks of bringing an unknown animal to his farm. He thought about the strict vaccination protocols for his elite cattle, the possible problems this could cause. His routine was already suffocating, with no fixed hours for rest, let alone for taking care of a sick dog. Logic dictated that he should continue on his way and let nature take its course. But something in that scene touched a place inside him that had remained locked for years, a place where he kept memories he preferred to bury along with other losses. There on the edge of that forgotten road, among eucalyptus trees that whispered in the wind, Frank Anderson understood that he couldn't turn his back and move on as if nothing had happened. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Let us know which city you're watching from. Now let's continue. The German shepherd remained motionless in the back seat of the pickup throughout the entire journey to the farm, only with half-open eyes observing the gradually changing landscape. Frank adjusted the rear-view mirror from time to time to check if the animal was still breathing, feeling an inexplicable anxiety growing in his chest. For years he hadn't worried about anything beyond numbers, contracts, and productivity, but now there was something different occupying his thoughts. When he drove through the wrought-iron gate with St. Anthony's Farm engraved in golden letters, he spotted Robert walking toward the office, a folder under his arm and that serious expression he always carried, when there were financial problems to discuss. The manager waved, but soon frowned when he realized that Frank wasn't stopping the truck in the administrative area as usual. "Mr. Anderson," Robert shouted, approaching quickly, "we need to resolve that interest issue on the loan before—" His sentence died in his throat when he saw Frank get out of the vehicle and head to the back door. The farmer carefully lifted the German Shepherd, which weighed much less than it should, and placed it on the red earth of the yard. The animal stood for a few seconds, wobbling, before collapsing again, breathing with difficulty. "My God, what is this?" Robert approached, adjusting his glasses. "Where did you find this animal?" "It's sick, Frank. It could contaminate the cattle, bring diseases. We have strict protocols here on the farm." Frank didn't respond immediately. He crouched again beside the dog, observing those brown eyes that seemed to carry a story of abandonment similar to his own. There was something in that gaze that awakened buried memories, sensations he preferred to keep locked in dark compartments of his soul. "Take him to the tool shed," he finally said, his voice lower than usual. "Prepare a corner with some old blankets and bring fresh water." "Mr. Anderson, with all due respect, but that's not prudent," Robert insisted, checking his watch. "We have a meeting in 15 minutes. The bank papers are waiting for your signature. And now you want to take care of a sick stray? This doesn't make sense." Frank rose slowly, fixing his eyes on Robert's with an intensity that made the manager take a step back. It was rare for the farmer to demonstrate authority through his gaze, but when it happened, everyone on the property knew there was no room for questioning. "Robert," he said in a measured voice, "you've worked with me for 15 years. Have I ever questioned your decisions when it came to numbers and contracts?" "No, sir." "Then don't question mine now. Take care of the animal as I asked. The meeting can wait another 15 minutes. The manager nodded, still confused, and walked away to get the requested materials. Frank remained crouched beside the German Shepherd, which had closed its eyes, but maintained regular breathing. For some reason, that scene brought back the memory of a distant afternoon, when he found a child injured after falling from a horse, and how his own knees trembled as he carried that small body to the house. "What should I call you?" he murmured, carefully running his hand over the animal's head. The dog slowly opened its eyes as if it had understood the question. "Thor. You look like a Thor." When Robert returned with the blankets and a bucket of water, he found Frank sitting on the dirt floor beside the animal, something he had never witnessed in all those years of work. The farmer had always been meticulous about his appearance, keeping his boots polished and clothes impeccable, even during the farm's most arduous activities. "Mr. Anderson, are you sure that—" "Robert," Frank interrupted him without taking his eyes off Thor. "Do you have children?" The question caught the manager off guard. "Yes, sir, 2, an 8-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl." "Then you must understand that sometimes we do things that don't make sense on the spreadsheet, but make sense in here," he said, touching his chest with his free hand. "Prepare the shed, and cancel today's meeting. Say there was an unexpected issue." Robert nodded, realizing that something had changed in his boss on that cloudy afternoon. Something he couldn't explain, but that was visible in the way Frank held that abandoned animal, as if he were holding much more than just an injured dog found by the roadside. Thor refused both food and water during the entire first day. He remained lying in a corner of the tool shed, on the blankets that Robert had prepared, just observing Frank's every movement with those deep brown eyes that seemed to carry ancient secrets. The farmer stopped by at least 5 times throughout the afternoon, always finding the same scene, the animal motionless but alert, as if studying every gesture, every word, every breath of his savior. "You're worried about him," commented Mrs. Susan, the farm's cook, as she served dinner on the porch of the main house. She was a 60-year-old woman with grey hair always tied in a bun, who had worked for the family for more than 2 decades. She had known Frank since he was a boy, and was one of the few people who allowed herself to speak to him as an equal. "Worried is a strong word," Frank replied, cutting his meat without appetite, "just checking if he's adapting." She murmured, removing the empty plates. He had eaten very little, which wasn't uncommon in recent years, but today he seemed even more distracted than usual. "You know abandoned animals take time to trust again, right? It's like hurt people. They need time." At Indy night, Frank worked later than usual, reviewing contracts and production reports on the porch illuminated by a single yellowish lamp. The cold July wind rustled the coffee plantation leaves, creating a constant whisper that always calmed him. Around 11 o'clock, he heard footsteps near the calf pen, a sound different from the farm's usual noises. He turned on the floodlight that illuminated the yard and swept the area with the beam of light. There was nothing beyond the familiar shadows of agricultural equipment and feed troughs, but just as he was about to turn off the light, he spotted Thor. The German shepherd was sitting near the old corral, completely motionless, staring fixedly into the darkness beyond the fences, as if seeing something that human eyes couldn't capture. "What are you seeing there, Thor?" Frank murmured, but the dog didn't move or look in his direction. He just remained in silent vigil, like a guardian protecting invisible memories. The next morning, Frank woke earlier than usual. He had dreamed of Pete, his son, running through the coffee plantations with a broad smile on his face, chasing yellow butterflies among the plants. In the dream, Thor was there too, running alongside the boy, both laughing or barking with pure joy. Upon waking, he felt a strange warmth in his chest, a forgotten sensation that took a few minutes to identify as longing mixed with something resembling hope. He headed to the shed with a bowl of warm milk and some pieces of bread. Thor was still, in the same corner, but this time he raised his head when he saw Frank approach. His eyes were no longer dull. There was a spark of curiosity in them that didn't exist the day before. "Good morning, buddy," Frank said, placing the bowl near the animal. "How about we start over?" Thor sniffed the milk, licked once, then twice. In a few minutes he had finished everything, including the pieces of bread. Frank felt a disproportionate satisfaction at seeing that small victory, as if he had closed the biggest deal of his career. "Great," he murmured, carefully stroking the German shepherd's head. "Now let's see if you have the strength for a walk." To his surprise, Thor got up with difficulty but remained standing. His movements were slow and cautious, but there was determination in them. Frank left the shed and the animal followed him, maintaining a respectful distance of 2 yards, as if knowing exactly where his place was in this new dynamic. They walked through the coffee plantations in silence, Frank checking the coffee plants that were beginning to flower, Thor observing everything with growing attention. From time to time, the dog would stop to smell something specific, a stone, a fallen branch, a mark in the earth, as if mapping his new territory through his senses. It was when they reached the old corral that something changed. Thor approached, a specific area near the wooden fence, began to smell intensely and, to Frank's astonishment, started digging. His weak paws worked with a sudden urgency, as if he knew exactly what he was looking for in that red earth that held as many secrets as the heart of his new owner. Frank observed Thor digging with an intensity that contrasted with his apparent weakness. The German shepherd's paws worked in the red earth as if guided by a primitive instinct, an urgent need to unearth something that had been there for a long time. The hole wasn't deep when the claws touched something solid, metallic, which produced a sound familiar to the farmer's ears. "What did you find there?" Frank murmured, crouching beside the animal. Thor backed up a few steps, panting, allowing Frank to finish the job with his own hands. When he removed the object from the earth, he felt his heart skip a beat. It was a blue toy car, rusted by time and moisture, but still recognizable. The same car that Pete carried everywhere when he was just 4 years old, pretending he was transporting coffee like his father. Frank held the toy with trembling hands, cleaning the stuck dirt with his thumb. The wheels still turned, emitting a soft creak that echoed in the depths of his memory, like a ghost that insists on returning. Thor sat beside him, breathing heavily, but never taking his eyes off the face of the man who had saved him. "How did you know this was here?" Frank asked quietly, but Thor just tilted his head, as dogs do when they don't understand the words but feel the emotions behind them. That afternoon, Frank cancelled all scheduled meetings and spent hours sitting on the porch, the blue car on the wooden table, watching Thor, who had chosen to lie near his feet. Mrs. Susan served coffee without asking questions, but her eyes expressed a maternal concern that she had cultivated for decades. "It's been a long time since I've seen that." "Car," she finally commented, placing the steaming cup next to the toy. "7 years," Frank replied without raising his eyes. "I thought it had disappeared when we renovated the corral." Little Pete loved to play there. He always said he'd be a farmer just like his father when he grew up. Mrs. Susan sighed, adjusting her apron. "He had a habit of burying treasures around the yard. Said he'd one day make a map for you to find everything." Frank felt his throat tighten. Pete really did have that habit. He buried toys, pretty stones, crumpled drawings, always promising to show the hiding places when he got older. But time was too cruel to allow these promises to be fulfilled. "Thor has a special way," Mrs. Susan continued, observing the German shepherd who seemed to be sleeping, but kept his ears attentive to every word. "An animal like that doesn't appear in your life by accident." That night Frank dreamed again of Pete, but this time the dream was different. He saw the boy playing in the old corral, digging holes in the earth while talking to himself, as children do when they create imaginary worlds. In the dream, Pete looked directly at him and smiled, pointing to the various mounds of earth scattered around the grounds. "Dad, I left several surprises for you," the childish voice echoed clear as crystal. "But you need help to find them, because you've grown too much and forgotten how to look for treasures." Frank woke up with his heart racing, cold sweat running down his temples. It was 3 in the morning, but he knew he wouldn't be able to go back to sleep. He put on his boots and walked to the shed, finding Thor awake as if waiting for him. "Can't sleep either?" he asked, and Thor stood up, wagging his tail for the first time since arriving at the farm. They walked together to the old corral, illuminated only by the light of the full moon that made the landscape silvery and ethereal. Frank turned on a flashlight and began to examine the ground, looking for other small mounds that might indicate more treasures buried by his son years ago. Thor methodically sniffed the ground, occasionally stopping at specific points and looking at Frank with expectation. It was as if the animal could feel the memories impregnated in the earth, as if he were able to map the emotional geography of that place through instincts that humans had lost long ago. "You can feel him, can't you?" Frank murmured, stroking Thor's head. "You can feel that he was here." Thor barked softly, the first sound he had made since his arrival at the farm, and headed to another spot near the fence. He began to sniff intensely, then looked at Frank, as if to say, "Here, dig here." Frank obeyed, and in a few minutes his hands touched another object. This time it was a drawing, artisanally laminated with adhesive tape, yellowed by time but still visible. It was a simple drawing, made with colored pencils, showing 2 figures holding hands, a large one, clearly representing Frank, and a small one which was Pete. Above them, drawn with childish strokes, was written, "Me and Daddy forever." The tears came without warning, silent and abundant, washing away years of repressed pain. Thor approached and rested his head on Frank's leg, offering the only comfort he knew how to give. His unconditional presence beside someone who also knew the universal language of loss and abandonment. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Let us know which city you're watching from. Now let's continue. 3 days after the episode at the old corral, Frank finally yielded to Robert's insistence and called the veterinarian from Lancaster to examine Thor. Dr. Mary Carter arrived at the farm on a sunny morning, driving a white van equipped with all the necessary materials for veterinary care. She was a 35-year-old woman with brown hair tied in a ponytail, who had earned the trust of farmers in the region for her competence and genuine care for animals. "So this is the famous Thor that Robert told me about," she said. Approaching the shed where the German shepherd was resting, Thor rose immediately, but instead of backing away as he did with other visitors, he remained still, observing her with curiosity. "He's more receptive than I imagined," Frank commented, surprised by the animal's reaction. Mary crouched down, slowly, extending her hand so Thor could smell it before any contact. Abandoned animals usually develop a keen instinct for recognizing people who don't pose a threat. "He knows I'm here to help." The examination was thorough but gentle. Mary talked to Thor throughout the entire process, her soft voice explaining each procedure, as if the animal could understand her words. Frank watched fascinated as she managed to calm Thor with simple gestures and tone of voice, something he himself was still learning to do. "He's malnourished, but there are no signs of serious diseases," Mary concluded after checking the preliminary blood tests. "Some old scars suggest mistreatment, but nothing that compromises his current health. With proper feeding and care, he'll recover completely." "And what about the farm's health protocols?" Frank asked, although he already knew he wouldn't give up Thor regardless of the answer. "I'll administer all the necessary vaccines today. In 15 days, he'll be able to interact." "With the cattle without any risk," Mary replied, preparing the syringes. "But may I ask a question? Why is this dog so important to you?" The question caught Frank off guard. He wasn't used to explaining his decisions, especially those that came from the heart rather than reason. He observed Thor, who remained calm even during the vaccine administration, and felt that there were no simple words to describe that inexplicable connection. "Sometimes we find someone who needs help at the exact moment we need it too," he finally answered. "Thor isn't just a dog I saved, I think he saved me too." Mary smiled, understanding more than the words revealed. She had worked with animals long enough to recognize when a special bond formed between human and animal, especially in cases of mutual healing. "I'd like to invite you for lunch," Frank said impulsively, surprising himself with his own spontaneity. It had been years since he had invited anyone for a meal at his house. Lunch on the porch was the first shared meal that Frank had without rushing in a very long time. Mary talked about her work, about the animals she treated, about the challenges of being a veterinarian in a rural area. Frank, in turn, found himself talking about the farm with a passion he thought he had lost, describing the coffee plantations, the expansion projects, even casually mentioning some memories of Pete that he hadn't shared with anyone in years. Thor remained lying at Frank's feet throughout the entire meal, as if he were the silent host of that unlikely meeting. Occasionally, Mary would throw small pieces of meat to him, which he accepted with elegance, always looking at Frank as if asking for permission. "He's chosen you as alpha," Mary observed. "That's rare in animals that have suffered abandonment. It usually takes months to develop that total trust." "How do you know that?" Frank asked, genuinely curious. "Observe his behavior. Thor doesn't just obey you, he protects you. When Robert approached too quickly a little while ago, did you notice how he positioned himself between the two of you? And the way he constantly observes you. It's not just gratitude, it's devotion." Frank looked at Thor, who at that moment raised his head as if he knew he was being discussed. His brown eyes shone with an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. When Mary was preparing to leave late in the afternoon, Frank felt a strange reluctance to see her go. The house would seem quieter after that afternoon of genuine conversations and laughter. "I'd like you to come back next week for Thor's checkup," he said, but they both knew there was more than veterinary concern in that invitation. "Of course," Mary replied, smiling. "And Frank, taking care of Thor is doing you good too. That's obvious to anyone who observes you today compared to how Robert described you before." After she left, Frank remained on the porch with Thor by his side, watching the sun set over the coffee plantations. For the first time in years, the silence of the farm didn't seem oppressive. It was a silence full of possibilities, of small hopes that were beginning to sprout like seeds after a long drought. The following week brought a routine that Frank hadn't experienced in years. Thor accompanied him in all farm activities, walking through the coffee plantations without barking, sitting patiently during office meetings, and lying at the feet of the table while Frank reviewed contracts. It was as if the German shepherd had been born for that life, adapting perfectly to the rhythm of the property. Robert, initially skeptical, began to admit that the animal's presence had brought positive changes to his boss. Frank smiled more, seemed less anxious during negotiations, and even showed interest in expanding certain farm activities that he had set aside in recent years. "I have to admit that you're different," commented Robert one afternoon, as they organized the coffee export documents. "More present, if I may say so." Thor, lying near the window, pricked up his ears upon hearing his name indirectly mentioned in the conversation. his eyes fixed on Frank with that protective intensity that Mary had identified, as if he were capable of reading every thought of his owner. It was on Wednesday that everything changed. Frank woke up as usual, at 5:30 in the morning, and went to the shed to get Thor for their morning walk through the coffee plantations. But the shed was empty. The blankets remained in the corner where the animal usually slept, but there was no sign of him anywhere. "Thor!" he shouted, leaving the shed. His voice echoed through the silent farmyard. "Thor, where are you?" He went through all the usual places, the calf pen, the area near the tractors, the office, even the porch of the house where Thor sometimes lay during the hottest afternoons. No trace. It was as if the animal had simply disappeared during the night. Mrs. Susan found Frank in the yard, clearly agitated, calling for the dog with an insistence that bordered on desperation. "Have you looked on the road?" she suggested, drying her hands on her apron. Sometimes traumatized animals have a habit of returning to where they were found. The idea terrified Frank. What if Thor had returned to that dusty road where he was abandoned? What if, for some incomprehensible reason, he had decided he didn't belong on the farm? The possibility of losing the animal now, after all that had happened, was unbearable. He took the pickup and traveled the entire road where he had found Thor, stopping at every curve, honking, shouting the animal's name through the open window. Other farmers in the region saw him passing several times through the same stretch, but no one had spotted a German shepherd loose on the road. He returned home with his hands trembling on the steering wheel. He couldn't concentrate on anything beyond Thor's absence. Robert tried to maintain the normal routine of the farm, but he could see that Frank was completely destabilized. "I'll call Dr. Carter," Robert suggested. "Maybe she has some idea of where to look." Mary arrived late in the afternoon, finding Frank sitting on the porch staring fixedly at the old corral, as if expecting to see Thor appear at any moment. His eyes were red from exhaustion and worry. "How long has he been missing?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Since last night. I woke up today and he wasn't in the shed," Frank replied hoarsely. "Mary, I can't lose him too. I can't." She noticed the word too, and understood that this disappearance had awakened fears much deeper than mere concern for a lost animal. "Frank, tell me what you're really feeling," she said softly. "It's not just about Thor, is it?" Frank remained silent for long minutes, watching the sun set behind the hills. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. When I lost my son, I swore I would never become attached to anything or anyone again. It was easier that way. Work, produce, move forward without looking back. But Thor, he brought back something I thought I had lost forever." "What did he bring back?" Mary asked. "The ability to care for someone again. To have something to protect beyond business and plantations," Frank sighed deeply. "And now he's gone, and I feel as if I've lost that chance to be human again." Mary held his hand, feeling the tension in his muscles, the palpable fear of another loss. "We'll look together," she said. "Animals like Thor don't simply run away without reason. He must be somewhere on the property, perhaps injured or trapped somewhere." But even as she spoke these reassuring words, Mary felt a growing uneasiness. Thor had demonstrated absolute devotion to Frank. For an animal with this type of bond to suddenly disappear, something very specific must have happened. Something that she still couldn't understand, but that she was sure would reveal much more about that farm and its buried secrets than any of them imagined. The search for Thor extended through the night. Frank and Mary traversed every corner of the property with flashlights, calling out for the animal, checking every shed, every fence, every possible hiding place. Robert and 2 employees joined the search, but the German shepherd seemed to have completely disappeared. It was when the first ray of sunlight began to gild the tops of the coffee plants that Frank heard something that made his heart race, a weak bark, distant, coming from the direction of the fruit orchard at the back of the property. It was an area he rarely visited in recent years, a place he avoided for reasons he preferred not to examine too deeply. "It's him!" he shouted, running toward the sound. Mary followed him, stumbling over the exposed roots and low branches of the fruit trees that had grown without proper pruning. They found Thor under a century-old mango tree, frantically digging a hole that was already almost 2 feet deep. The animal was dirty with earth, panting, but his eyes shone with a determination that Frank had never seen before. Seeing them approach, Thor barked once and returned to digging, as if wanting to show that his mission was not yet complete. "Thor, what are you doing?" Frank knelt beside the animal, but Thor continued digging, his paws working with desperate urgency. It was Mary who noticed first. "Frank, look there." She pointed to an object that was beginning to emerge from the disturbed earth. "It looks like a box." Carefully, Frank moved Thor aside and finished digging with his own hands. What emerged was a small metal box, rusty but still intact, the kind used to store important documents. His hands trembled as he picked it up, and a strange presentiment took hold of his chest. "Do you know this box?" Mary asked softly. Frank nodded slowly. "It was Pete's. He got it for his birthday when he turned 5. Said he was going to keep all the most important treasures in the world inside." With trembling fingers, he opened the lid, which gave way with a metallic creak. The interior was lined with aluminum foil that Pete had placed to protect his treasures from moisture. Inside were several small objects, colored stones, a baby tooth, some old coins, and at the bottom, carefully folded, a sheet of paper. Frank unfolded the paper with extreme care. It was a letter written in Pete's childish and irregular handwriting, in blue pencil that had faded but was still legible. "Dear Daddy, if you're reading this, it's because you found my most important treasure. I buried it here in the orchard, because it's our special place where you taught me to climb the mango tree. Daddy, I know that sometimes you get sad after Mummy left, but I want you to know that even when I grow up and become a man like you, I'll always be your little boy. And when I have children, I'll teach them to climb the mango tree too. You're the best daddy in the whole world, and I love you more than anything. I took care of you while I was here, and if one day I can't take care of you anymore, I'll send someone special to take care of you for me, I promise. Your son who loves you forever, Pete. P.S. Don't be sad when you find this. Be happy because it means you didn't give up looking for treasures." Tears fell freely down Frank's face as he read and reread the letter. Mary placed her hand on his shoulder, also moved, but it was Thor who approached and rested his head on Frank's knee, as if understanding the importance of that moment. "He knew," Frank murmured with a broken voice. "Pete knew that one day I would need someone to take care of me." He looked at Thor, who was watching him with those brown eyes full of ancient wisdom. "And he sent you, didn't he? Somehow he sent you to me." Thor barked softly, just once, as if confirming what Frank had understood. It was impossible to rationally explain how an animal had managed to locate not only the car buried in the corral, but also find that box buried in a completely different place on the property. But sometimes life offers connections that transcend logic, bonds that form beyond what the mind can process. Mary watched the scene with tears in her eyes, understanding that she was witnessing something much greater than a man rediscovering lost memories. It was the moment when Frank finally allowed himself to believe that love doesn't end with the physical departure of those we love, but transforms itself, finds new paths, new ways to manifest. "Thor didn't come to you by chance," she said softly. "Some encounters are greater than ourselves." Frank held the letter against his chest and, for the first time in 7 years, smiled through his tears. "Thank you, son," he whispered to the wind that rustled the leaves of the mango tree. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Thor stood up and wagged his tail, and in that simple gesture, Frank saw confirmation that his journey back to life had only just begun. The orchard, which he had avoided for so long because of painful memories, was becoming a meeting place again, a place where the past and present united to build a future that was finally worth living. 6 months after the day Thor unearthed Pete's letter, St. Anthony's farm breathed a completely different energy. The orchard had been restored, the trees carefully pruned, and a small wooden bench had been placed under the century-old mango tree, where Frank often spent afternoons reading or simply watching Thor run between the plants. Pete's letter, framed, occupied a place of honor on the office wall, next to a photo of the boy smiling among the coffee plants. Frank no longer tried to hide memories of his son. On the contrary, He spoke of him naturally, sharing funny stories with employees, visitors, and especially with Mary, who had become a constant presence on the farm. "Pete would love to see Thor running around here," commented Frank on a sunny afternoon, watching the German shepherd chase butterflies among the coffee seedlings. He always wanted a big dog like this. Mary, who now had lunch with him at least 3 times a week, smiled as she organized some veterinary papers on the porch table. "I think he is seeing," she said softly, "and he must be proud of how you two take care of each other." Robert, who had initially resisted Thor's presence, now boasted to other farmers about the animal's exceptional intelligence. Thor had developed an impressive ability to detect problems on the farm before any human noticed them. He alerted to broken fences, cattle with strange behavior, and even to the presence of suspicious visitors long before they reached the main gate. "This dog is worth more than an electronic security system," Robert commented proudly during a meeting with suppliers. "I've never seen anything like it." Mrs. Susan, always observant, noticed even more subtle changes in Frank. He laughed more, slept better, and had begun to make plans for the future for the first time in years. He talked about expanding cattle breeding, modernizing certain areas of the property, and even about the possibility of offering rural tourism for families who wanted to experience an authentic coffee farm. "Are you thinking about starting a family again?" she asked one morning, as she prepared breakfast and watched Frank play with Thor in the yard. The question caught him off guard, but it didn't bother him as it would have months ago. "I'm thinking about living again, Mrs. Susan, and that includes being open to all possibilities." Mary, who heard the comment from the kitchen, felt her heart race. In recent months, what had begun as professional veterinary visits had transformed into something much deeper. She found herself thinking about the farm and Frank during her other appointments, counting the days until the next visit, and discovering that she was falling in love not just with the man, but with the entire story of overcoming and new beginnings. During a particularly starry night, Frank invited her to walk to the orchard. Thor accompanied them as always, but this time he maintained a respectful distance, as if understanding that this moment required privacy. "Mary," Frank began, stopping under the mango tree where everything had changed. "These last months have been the best I've had in many years. You helped me rediscover that I'm still capable of caring for someone, of feeling, of building something new." She held his hand, feeling the calm strength that now radiated from Frank. He was a transformed man, someone who had gone through the deepest valley of pain and emerged stronger, more complete. "I've fallen in love," he continued. "Not just with you, but with this new version of myself that you helped me find. For the first time in 7 years, I can imagine a future that includes happiness, family, laughter echoing through this house again." The kiss happened naturally, sealing a promise that didn't need to be spoken. Thor, observing from a distance, wagged his tail discreetly, as if approving the union that he himself had helped facilitate. Months later, when Mary moved to the farm, she brought with her a small female dog named Luna, who quickly became Thor's inseparable companion. The main house came alive again, with animated conversations during meals, music playing in the kitchen, and the sound of hurried footsteps through the corridors. Frank, watching Thor play with Luna in the yard, sometimes still whispered "thank you" to the wind, knowing that somewhere Pete was smiling to see that his promise had been fulfilled in a more beautiful way than any child could imagine. The farm continued producing the best coffee in the region, but now it also produced something even more valuable: living proof. That true love never ends. It just transforms, reinvents itself, and finds new ways to flourish, even in hearts that thought they had forever lost the capacity to love. And Thor, the silent guardian who had arrived at the roadside like an angel disguised as an abandoned dog, continued fulfilling his mission: to protect, to care for, and to remind Frank every day that some encounters are true miracles waiting to happen. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that like button. Let us know which city you're